what AP does here is it talks about colonial fighting between the different colonizing powers, French, British, Dutch, and Spanish. But it also talks about how that also impacted the Native Americans and what role they played and how it impacted them and everything like that. So make sure you're aware of that. Now, like I said, a lot of this has to do with AP concepts here. Now, basically, they talk about the European efforts here to colonize all these folks is going to, quote, intensify conflict. You might want to highlight that. And let's talk about what that means. Now, Indians were fighting before Europeans got here. Contrary to what my professor in college, Dr. Randall, said in my anthropology class, and I tended to listen to professors and never disagree with them. I figured those people were smarter than me. They probably forgotten more than Mr. D will ever know. But when my professor, Dr. Randall, said Native Americans lived in peaceful harmony until Europeans came, I'm like, wait a minute. Wait a minute. What did you just say? And I proceeded to say, what about the Aztecs and what they did? What about the Algonquins and the Iroquois? What about these groups? I said they were fighting long beforehand. I said, I will admit that it got worse and we intensified it, or I didn't know if I used the word intensified, but we definitely made it somewhat worse. And he had to agree that, yeah, that was probably right. It wasn't the Garden of Eden after all. Otherwise, y'all, I never ever said anything in college like that to disagree. I stayed quiet. I took my test. I regurgitated stuff and graduated pretty well. Okay. But definitely, y'all, Europeans are going to intensify it, and you need to be able to give me examples and talk about how that happened and what that means. So, the big idea here, okay, is how do these conflicts change Native Americans in Europe socially and politically? What does it lead to? Okay. So you need to know some of those conflicts, and mainly, I mean, it's going to be an interchange of cultures. Native Americans are going to play off different groups against each other. I mean, they're going to show their agency and do some of that kind of thing. But ultimately, it's going to lead a lot of it to their destruction, okay, or near destruction. Although I'll give you a couple hopeful stories that come out of this as well too. Now, this is from your AP curriculum once again. What are they competing over, the Europeans? Well, obviously land and the resources in those lands. So you're going to see some conflict between the North Americans and, with each other, but also with the Indians. And, the fighting that they're having over in Europe, y'all, is going to spread over here. In fact, there's a series of wars that I don't talk about anymore. Queen Anne's War and the War of Jenkins Ear and all these kind of things that we don't really get into that happen. But there are a series of wars, most of which start overseas in Europe and then make their way here. Ironically, the biggest and the last of these colonial wars, the French and Indian Wars, we call it, actually starts here in America when a young kid by the name of George Washington starts it, right? Ironically. Okay. And so this is going to lead to a certain amount of instability in the Native American people's world. Now, the thing is here, y'all, one way that these conflicts were intensified is by Europeans supplying the Indians with weapons. Now, there were a couple of reasons why they would do this. Now, once again, I like to use the metaphor, y'all, of aliens with incredibly superior technology invading Earth, right? They come here and they have like the death ray and the disintegrator ray that makes you into little atoms or something. And, we got our little guns and stuff and they don't do any good. Well, what we would want, y'all, is hey, how do we get some of those weapons? And so Native Americans, when they quickly saw the range of muskets and pistols, the wound, the impact that those would have on a human body, y'all, they very quickly decided we want these weapons. And basically, the question was, what is it going to take Europeans to get us these weapons? And the Dutch and the French, perhaps, y'all, were those most likely to get them weapons. And what they wanted were furs. So you go out, you find me some beaver pelts, bring me back 10 or 20 of them. I'll get you one of these guns. They were willing to do that. But there was another reason they wanted to get them firearms. Native Americans, y'all, would be used in wars by the colonizers against their enemies. Now, they didn't have the word then, but we do today. and we call that a proxy war, as in Proxy. For example, you guys have heard, I know, of the Korean War. You've heard of the Vietnam War. In Vietnam, y'all, America and South Vietnam were fighting together side by side to preserve their country. North Vietnam was fighting to take over South Vietnam and unify the country into one piece. Now, South or North Vietnam could not possibly have pulled that off, y'all, without weapons from China and the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union and Chinese did not actually send soldiers to fight against the Americans and the South Vietnamese. Instead, they relied on the North Vietnamese doing the fighting. Now, jump ahead to the 1980s. The Soviet Union has invaded Afghanistan. We want to pay them back. We want to hurt and kill Soviets. So what do? We help arm the Afghan rebels called the Mujahideen to fight against the Soviets. Americans aren't getting killed. Afghans are getting killed, killing Soviets. Okay. That's called a proxy war, when you arm somebody else and you have them do your fighting. So in some ways, this is what the Europeans were doing. So they would trade the Indians weapons, or they would give them weapons in the hope that they would use them against their enemies. So they reward Indian military actions. And this is going to increase the destructiveness. These weapons did a lot more damage than arrows did. Not that I'd want to get shot by an arrow, y'all, but imagine what a big musket ball would do. If you guys were here in class, we had more here because I've gotten behind my lecture, and I have some of those musket balls, y'all, and they are about the size of a big marble. I mean, when they hit you, I mean, they crush the bone. They don't just break it or snap it, y'all. They crush it. It ain't going to grow back. Oftentimes, the only solution is to like cut through and saw off that bone, right? That's the kind of damage, or maybe it might even bounce around inside of you, doing all kinds of internal damage. Whereas an arrow, it's going to go in, it's going to be bad, but you might be able to extract it, right? Think about what cannons could do, the impact that a cannon would have on a person or a group of people. And one that's often mentioned, although it doesn't play so much a role with the British and the Indians in their region, is the horse shawl, right? Now, a horse was like a modern day tank in a lot of ways, if you think about it, right? Now, instead of moving at the speed that you could walk or run, really 3-4 miles an hour, you could hop on a horse and you could travel 100 or a couple hundred miles in a day. You could attack your enemy, take what you want, and get the heck out of there. So it's going to mean maybe tribes that before had been separated by distance and maybe didn't fight. Now you could find those tribes, you could kill them, take their stuff, and then of course they're going to want revenge and that kind of thing. And then also, let's say you're a tribe and you don't have these weapons. Maybe you don't even want the weapons. If your enemies, your traditional enemies, have these weapons, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to get them to be able to keep your world, to keep what you have. And so the temptation is going to be very strong for the Indians to get these weapons and then to use them. And of course, it is going to lead to a lot much more conflict and that kind of thing. So it's pretty much simple to say that after the introduction of these weapons, and particularly the terrible damage of alcohol, because sadly, y'all, Europeans found that a lot of the Indian men had a big taste for alcohol. You could give it to them, you could get them drunk, and oftentimes they would sign or give away stuff that they, under normal consensus, they wouldn't. They could get addicted to alcohol as people get addicted to, drugs and stuff today. And then virtually they might do anything to get more of that alcohol. And it still is a problem in a lot of Indian communities and in reservations, y'all. I've just seen some terrible things of addiction on those reservations, even to this day. So the tribes are going to do whatever it takes to get those guns, to get those weapons, to get those knives, to get those cool tools, to get the gunpowder, to be able to keep fighting, to get the horses. Although the horses, y'all, they did what horses do. They escaped. They made little horses, right? Lots of little horses. So you didn't have to trade as much for those. Okay. Now, I'm not going to talk much about it. Used to be several slides, but suffice to say, I guess that's the word, that there is a thing called the Beaver Wars. And here we got our friend Bucky, cleanest restrooms around, right? Makes me want to drive down 45 today to Dickinson or Lamarck and get me some wonderful food at Bucky's. But anyway, um, the Bucky Wars, I mean, the Beaver Wars, y'all, these were wars between Indian tribes that were supported by colonial powers. And what was it all about? It was about getting land where there were beavers to be able to get the pelts. Now, one of the things that's going to happen is Native Americans, because of their numbers and also because of their beliefs, they didn't overhunt animals. They didn't usually try to wipe them out. They took what they needed. Their numbers were small, so they didn't pretty much wipe out any communities of animals. But when they start needing these guns, when they start needing this alcohol, they tend to start over hunting and pretty soon and over trapping. And before long, y'all, they've pretty much wiped out the beaver in their own areas. So what do they got to do? They got to go find more land. Well, the trouble is that might be owned by another Indian tribe. And so by you trying to go get that land to get the pelts, to get the stuff you want, you're now fighting another Indian group. Now, the biggest war, and you don't need to write this down, is going to be during the Beaver Wars between the Algonquin Indians of what is today kind of Canada up there, y'all, and upper New York, and the Iroquois Indians. Iroquois come out on top and they take a bunch of land. But if you guys ever have to talk about, what did this lead to? How does it intensify things? Drop in the word Beaver Wars, and your reader would be happy that, oh, yeah, the Beaver Wars. So he knows about this. Or you could say in which tribes fought tribe to get beaver pelts for trading purposes. You do that, they're going to be happy. Okay, bye, Bucky. Okay, now, the other thing here, y'all, is there's going to be other wars that happen for similar reasons to get those. Now, the British have the most to offer, y'all, but to be honest, the British are kind of stingy. For one thing, remember, they don't really like the Indians. If I'm going to give you stuff the British say, it's going to have strings attached to it. Whereas the French, they had fewer people. The French, they had to sort of bribe the Indians. They gave them stuff, right? And they even intermarried with them, whereas the British, we know, wouldn't do that. Now, this is going to benefit the French to a certain extent. When we get that French-Indian War, or as they called it in Europe, the 7 Years' War, because it only lasted 7 years there. It lasted 9 years here. We started it. We fought it for like 2 years before they got on the wagon and started fighting too. All natives, y'all, almost all, are going to join the French. That is why we call it the French and Indian War, because who were the colonists and and British fighting together? They were fighting the French and the Indians. The exception is going to be the Iroquois, who either stay neutral, right, or they eventually join up with the British and the Americans. Okay, key concept here, okay? There's going to be some real changes in cultures and things like that. Now, the Native Americans are going to become very dependent on the Europeans. Now, you and I don't know how many of you hunt. If you do, that's great. I'm glad you can do that. I did that a few times as a child, but I don't really remember what to do after if you do get the animal. How to field strip it or whatever you do and prepare it for cooking or whatever. Heck, I probably can't even clean a fish anymore. I remember my dad showing me that, and I got grossed out and didn't do it. But I do remember this, y'all. I remember one day my grandmother, who's been gone now many, many years, she died while I was in high school, but she walked out into the barn. She got us a little chicken, not a little, decent sized chicken, and she just right there in front of me snapped its neck, got a hatchet, cut off its head, stripped it of its feathers, cleaned it all out, cut it up, and we were eating fried chicken that night. Now, I couldn't do that. I wouldn't know the steps. I don't know if I could have the whatever to do it. Because you and I get dependent now on Crochet and Walmart and Aldi to do all that work for us. HEB, right? They do that. It comes in a nice package. I put stuff on it, put in the oven, and it's done. Or man, maybe I even microwave it. So you lose the ability to do that. Or maybe you've spent generations, your tribe making tools, making weapons, and you're pretty good at it. But when this guy gives you a gun for a few beaver pelts, you're like, why should I make this bow and arrow anymore? This is much better. I'll just keep bringing him stuff and he'll give me more weapons and things. And so over time, you lose the ability to make stuff for yourself. And that has some real consequences, because when you can't do it anymore yourself, then you become more dependent on the people who are supplying it. So all of this is going on. And it wasn't just guns, y'all. Native Americans, as I said, like the alcohol, some of them, but also they like the clothes. They like the fabric, the shiny or bright colors. They like some of that kind of stuff. Also, Native Americans showed us some great agricultural techniques. Farmers how to plant and how to do things that way. They also showed us some great herbal remedies, like, hey, if you get this, take this, you know, and that might help. So there was an interchange of some ideas there too. But over time, as the Europeans began to expand, and for example, tobacco tended to burn up the land, you needed more land, and more settlers came over. And as they did so, y'all, they began to make their way into Indian land. Now, Indians had a couple choices. Do you fight and probably ultimately lose? Do you try to stay and maybe work out something, but of course, probably get disease and die? Or do you go west and try to get away from these English or these Frenchmen or whatever? Now, if you do go west, you're probably going to run into other Indians who may not like you coming into their hood, right? And so you're going to have problems that way. So there weren't a lot of choices for Native Americans. And in New England, where we have some numbers here, you can see that in about 1600, 20 years before the Pilgrims came, we guesstimate there were around 100,000 natives living in New England. In about 50 years after they arrived, the Europeans, there's only 10,000 of them remaining. That's 90%. Even Mr. D can do that math, which I couldn't do much math on the PSAT. I was telling my first and third period, y'all, you got this PSAT coming up. Please review your math, okay? Please review the math and make sure you can do what you can, because I've always forgot my math and it hurt me on the PSAT. So why? Disease was the big thing, y'all. In fact, when the Pilgrims come ashore in 1620, they are surprised to find kind of an abandoned Indian village with huts and stuff there, and no Indians. And they find lots of food, corn and beans and stuff that have been buried for the tough times ahead or whatever for the winter. And they're like, wow, what a present. Thanks, God. Thanks for wiping out these Indians and having them leave food. Well, what did wipe out the Indians? Disease. Okay. So what happened, y'all? You okay there? All right. Okay. What happened, y'all, was the Indians were especially weak in New England. As I just said, epidemics had already wiped out or would wipe out about 75% of them. There is a group of Indians known as the Wampanoags. You don't need to know that name. Don't worry about spelling that. But they're the ones that are going to befriend the Pilgrims when they first come ashore. Now, the man who does this is a fascinating character in American history, y'all, who was called Tisquantum. But the Pilgrims very quickly just called him Squanto because, they always had a hard time understanding the names. Now, Squanto had been kidnapped at one point by some Europeans and taken back to Europe. And there he had learned multiple languages and made his way back to his people. Well, an epidemic had wiped out most of his people. Now, Squantum is a smart man. He knows he can't probably make it on his own. So what he does is basically offer himself as sort of a diplomat between Indians like the Wampanoags and Europeans. And so this guy, y'all, goes around talking to groups and, making treaties and things like that. And it's an amazing story, Squanto's story there. Now, one of the treaties he makes, probably the most important one that he makes, is between the Pilgrims and a chief called Massasoit. Now, Massasoit was the leader of this local group of Wampanoags, and he works out a deal with him. Now, why did the Indians do this? Well, they knew, y'all, that they couldn't, they maybe could defeat the Pilgrims right away, but they probably would just send more. And so what do? Well, how about using these people against your enemies? Just like Powhatan wanted to use the people in Jamestown against his enemies, they figure we can use these Pilgrims and their cool weapons against our enemies, the Narragansetts Indians of what is today Rhode Island. So he makes this treaty. And to really culminate everything, y'all, in late 1621, in the autumn of 1621, Pilgrims and Indians sit down together. and they give Massasoit this really cool red coat or red blanket thing that he really prized and wore. And so they sit down, and what do they thank everybody for? Well, the Pilgrims thank the fact that they somehow survived that first Thanksgiving, which nearly wiped them out. They're thankful for peace with these Indians. They're thankful for everything like that. And of course, they call it Thanksgiving. Now, this picture here, y'all, shows you it's a painting showing some of that as we believe it might have looked. You see the Pilgrims' homes back there, pretty simple buildings with thatched or dried grass roofs. The Indians really outnumber the Pilgrims at this point. You do see some scenes of them sitting side by side right here, but you also see a lot of Indians just kind of all together and separate there. So it's kind of interesting how they're portrayed in this picture. And that's what you guys should do if you're given a picture like this. Don't like, oh, cool picture. Really examine it, break it up into sections, and start looking there. Okay, what are these people doing? What's going on over here? What does that say? What is the point of view of this person? Okay. And so we see them sitting down to eat, but like I said, there's a lot of Indians there just kind of watching what's going down. Now, in 1863, y'all, during some of the worst days of the Civil War, President Lincoln wants the nation to thank that they have made it so far. Because the first part of the Civil War does not go very well for the Union or for the North. They lose battle after battle. But in July of 1863, there is the turning point, the Battle of Gettysburg. The North wins a decisive victory, and the South is not able to ever really recover from losing at Gettysburg. So Lincoln proclaims a national day of Thanksgiving for that. It's right at the end of November when it will be celebrated. Not too long after he does his famous Gettysburg Address. Okay, that's the way it stays for years. Thanksgiving is almost in December every year. But then in the 1930s, America is in a Great Depression. People are out of work. People aren't buying things nearly enough to employ people making stuff, transporting the stuff, and selling the stuff. So President Roosevelt gets an idea. Why don't we move Thanksgiving up? Now, the thing is, y'all, what is the day after Thanksgiving called? Black Friday, right? Black Friday, y'all, a weird supernatural thing takes place. I don't know if you guys have ever noticed it. Mild-mannered women, mild-mannered men become animals, right? They attack people to get big screen TVs, to do whatever it takes. They knock down the doors at Walmart. They trample people, all to save a few bucks, okay? And that's because Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, means it's time to start shopping for Christmas. And so what Roosevelt did, y'all, was giving us, by moving up Thanksgiving a week, he gave Americans an extra week to shop with the hope that they would do what? They would shop. And what would this do? It would give people working in the stores more jobs because more people buying stuff. It would mean that American workers would go back to work making this stuff for those people to buy. And of course, people transporting it, storing it, doing all that. And it might have worked. And so to this day, y'all, we still have economists sometimes say, oh, Thanksgiving is kind of falling late this year. That's going to hurt. Christmas sales are going to be down. Or, whoa, Christmas sales are going to be higher this year because Thanksgiving is coming early this year. Okay. And, I don't know if it works, but maybe the extra time means you have more time to buy gifts, or maybe you see something like, oh, I know I already got her this, but, now I see this, so I'm going to get her that too, right? So now we come to some of the first wars, and Mr. D finds these wars particularly interesting because they involve the Pequot Indians. Now, Mr. D's first wife, not married anymore, thank goodness. My first wife, y'all, was from this area of Connecticut right here. So, of course, we visited her mom a lot and everything like that. And then ultimately, my daughter moved back up there with her. And I would visit up there for Thanksgiving and Christmas and summer and all of that. So I got to know the area really, really well. And one group really fascinated me, y'all, and that were the Pequot Indians. And I hadn't heard a whole lot about them. Now, they were the most powerful tribe in what is today Connecticut and this river valley right here. People were terrified of these Indians. And they had good reason to be, y'all, because the word Pequot apparently meant eaters of men. or man eaters. In other words, not only did they capture you and kill you, but somewhere in between, they might eat you as well too. And I don't know about you, but that's terrifying to think of being consumed by another human being. They didn't eat you because they needed the food. They ate you because they wanted to. And whether they really did that much, that was the reputation. So it scared people, but it also caused a lot of tribes, y'all, to hate their guts and to want the worst for this particular tribe. Okay, so in the late 1636, 1637, the so-called Pequot War, the first one at least, starts. Now, how did it start? You probably don't need to know this, but I'm just going to sort of tell you the story. There had been this guy in one of the Puritan towns by the name of Captain Stone. He had a little ship, a little boat that he used. And Captain Stone, y'all, was awful. He was just a real, oh man, the women just hate him because he was always trying to pick them up. He was always flirting with the women at church, no less. And people just couldn't stand the guy. Now, he kind of was like an early bounty hunter, and there were a couple Pequot who were wanted for something that they had done. So he goes and he picks up the Pequot, arrests them, whatever, puts them on his boat, and he's taking them back to the authorities. Well, the Pequot are tied up, but they manage to get loose. And when they do, they don't just attack him. That's right. What do Pequot do? They ate Captain Stone. Now, the people back in Puritan land, they didn't like Captain Stone. A lot of them like, yeah, good job. But they were like, they ate him? That's just wrong, man. You don't eat a guy even if we hate him. And this is going to become the basis for them going to war with the Pequot. They just needed the spark, and they got it. Now, as I said, a lot of Native Americans did not like the Pequot. And so the Narragansetts, and this is a good example you could use, the Narragansetts of what is today Rhode Island ally themselves with the whites to once and for all take care of these Pequot, okay? Now, the Pequot were living in a fort on a river that today is called the Mystic River. There is a town right over here, y'all, called Mystic Seaport. Man, if you guys ever get up to New England, and you need to, it's absolutely beautiful. Go to Mystic Seaport. Go to Mystic Town. It is just charming as heck. But it was a scene of a terrible tragedy once upon a time, because on this river, there was a fort, kind of traditional, almost European-like fort, with a palisade, the pointy sticks all around it. Well, the colonists show up. They make their way in during the night, and they set fire to the fort. Now, of course, if you're a Pequot, you got two choices: stay and burn or try to get out. But when they tried to run out, the Puritans were all waiting for them with their muskets and their pistols, and they shot them dead. Now, if somehow you got through the fire, you got through the Puritans, Narragansetts were in an outer ring waiting with knives, waiting with bows and arrows. So virtually, y'all, the Pequots ceased to exist. They are almost all annihilated unless they happen to be gone. What few were left, the Narragansetts take, and they try to convert basically into Narragansetts, changing their culture, changing their language, and doing all that. Now, only a handful of Pequots existed. Now, ironically, in one of the weirdest relationships in American history, one of the Pequots becomes a servant of John Winthrop. That's right. We shall be as a city upon a hill guy. And they kind of befriend each other as much as an Englishman and an Indian can do. But he kind of starts telling them of their plight and everything. And Winthrop gives him a big section of land that is theirs to have, kind of the future reservation kind of thing. Well, there aren't many Pequots to live on it, but what they do, y'all, is they make sure there is always at least one Pequot living on that land and never leaving it, because they fear, and it might be true, if they do leave it and abandon it, it will get being taken over. And George Washington even supports this tree. So the Pequot, y'all, managed to have this land that is Pequot Nation territory long before any other Indian tribes negotiate such a deal. Now, as bad as this war is, it basically does bring peace until King Philip's War, because no other Indians are going to challenge the English after they saw what happened to the Pequot. So it's awful, but it does bring about a very long-lasting peace for about 40 years until, as I said, King Philip's War. Now, I do have a couple little video excerpts, but in the interest of time, I might just post them for you guys to watch if you want to see more and learn more about Pequot are going to get their revenge. And it happens in an interesting way. Remember that land that they got that was given to them? Well, that's their land. It doesn't really belong to Connecticut or the United States. Now, gambling is illegal in Connecticut. Gambling is illegal in most of the United States at this point. And so what they do to try to make some money for the handful of Pequots still living on that land is they say, you know what? We're going to build a casino. We're going to play some bingo here. And so they open it up and they have never shut their doors since. Ultimately, you're going to see not just bingo, slot machines, all the gambling that you associate today with Vegas. Now, this is one of the world's largest casinos in any place. So you go, what does this have to do with all this, Mr. D? Well, the thing is, if you can prove that you have Pequot blood, and I don't mean you got to be like 50% or anything, that's almost impossible to find, 1/16th, 1/32nd, 1/64th, anything in there, you are entitled to some of the revenues of it. Now, I'll tell you another funny story. It's kind of embarrassing. Just as I met my wife, she'd moved down here, my wife to be at the time, she'd moved down here after a breakup with a guy who was a Pequot. Poor kid, right? Didn't have anything. All right, so we get married, we have kids, all that kind of stuff. And ultimately, of course, she marries me, a teacher, and I have no money. In the meantime, his family, as a Pequot family, gets a chunk of the casino. He becomes a millionaire. And she ended up with a teacher. And not even forever. But she moved back up there, but it was too late. He was already married. He was already rich. And I mean, they're Rick James rich, y'all. I mean, some of them have like different cars for every day. And I was talking to my stepson up there, and he was just saying, he said, yeah, you would think that's good. But the trouble is, he said, you get all this money, and pretty soon, you know, you're buying too much stuff, you're running in fast crowds. There's a lot of drug problems with a lot of these kids whose parents have everything. So they do get revenge on those white settlers, people from New York, people from Boston go to Foxwoods. And they've even built two more casinos. There's a Mohegan Sun for the Mohegan Indians and another one that they keep talking about building. But I just say that, y'all, because it's kind of an interesting sort of story. Now, the English are going to get a lot of grief from fellow English people in England when they start hearing the stories about the atrocity at Fort Mystic. The story is written down. People hear about it and they're like, you burned women and children alive? You slaughtered them like that? That's awful. You know, isn't there some other way that you could work with them? And so we see the beginning of the only really serious effort by the British and the American colonists to work with the Indians and to try to convert them to Christianity. The man doing this, his name is up on the board there. I know it's kind of small, is John Eliot with a single L. Now, Eliot goes to some amazing work, y'all. He translates the Bible into Indian language. He does all kinds of things. He lives with the Indians. He really does try to save them. Now, of course, by saving them, though, he's going to have to kill a lot of their culture. If you're going to do this, you're going to take a Christian name. You're going to dress like a Christian in many ways. You're going to worship. You're going to live as English Christians do. And essentially what this is, y'all, is assimilation, where you have to give up your previous culture to adopt the culture of this new group that you're with. And so it comes at a price. Now, some Indians did it better than dying. Some really came to believe it. But it is the only real effort that the English ever do to try to to try to Christianize the Indians. Now, we're not going to really continue this policy. He's going to be the first one to try this until the 1880s, y'all. Now, by the 1880s, most Native Americans had been defeated, killed, or forced to live on reservations. And so in the 1880s, we get this idea basically to kill the Indian to save the man. The idea is kill what's in him that is Indian so that we can save him. Those were the friends of the Indians. People who didn't like the Indians, they simply said, kill the Indian. This guy believed you could save Indians if you changed the Indians. And so in the 1880s, we passed the Dawes Act. And essentially what we did, y'all, is we tried to make Native Americans into farmers. Here's you some land, okay, grow food. And but I'm a man, I'm supposed to be hunting, I'm supposed to be fighting, I'm not supposed to be a farmer. And they really, really rejected it. We took Indian children and we put them into schools, y'all, boarding schools, where they cut off their Indian long hair. We gave them Christian names. We taught them Christianity. We taught them English, and a lot of their customs almost disappeared, y'all. We came really close to losing a lot of that culture. But in the 1930s, we passed something called the Wheeler Act. And the Wheeler Act said, look, we need to find some way to preserve this. Unfortunately, y'all, there were people who had been children in the 1880s when this was passed, who had still remembered the ways, who remembered the cultures. And so those people in the 1930s are going to educate a whole new generation and pass on those Indian cultures, languages, customs, religion, or whatever. But we came awfully close to losing it. So this is an early effort to do it. I mean, he thought he was doing right. He was saving their souls. He did everything he could to reach them without using any violence. But these villages, y'all, are going to be they're going to be destroyed during King Philip's War when we talk about that. Okay, now we're going to get to the New England Confederation here. Now, as a result of this war, the Pequot War, the decision is made, hey, these separate colonies, they need to really do something to kind of come together. Now, it's called a confederation, which means a loose alliance. It's not like a country where you have Washington, D.C. telling everybody else what to do. You keep your independence, but you work together in matters of trade and for military purposes. So Connecticut in those days, y'all, had two different colonies. They come together. You also have the two different colonies in Massachusetts. Massachusetts Bay and the Pilgrims, right, are going to come together. Now, part of the deal is this too. Anybody that runs away, a servant, like, hey, maybe I've got 3 years left of my contract, I'm gonna run to Connecticut from Rhode Island, and I can get away with it. Well, they set up extradition. You could go from Rhode Island, pick up your servant, and bring him back, or maybe criminals. But they also, y'all, they wanted to protect themselves against the Dutch, who were still a threat, and also particularly the French, who were a threat, just further north into the west. The way it would work is every colony was equal. And I make a big deal of that, y'all, because Rhode Island, which was not going to be included here, is much smaller. Connecticut, not nearly as important as Massachusetts Bay, but everybody would be given 2 votes. Rhode Island, and let me do that again here, y'all, okay? Rhode Island was excluded. Survey says wrong answer, right? So no Rhode Island. They still were prejudiced against Rhode Island for taking in all those dissidents and everything like that. Now, why is this important? One of the topics that sometimes comes up on AP test, y'all, is the steps to American unification. How did America, the idea of a country, of unification, of coming together as a country start? Because these colonies are very different. New England colonies, very different from Middle Atlantic colonies, very different from your southern colonies, and yet they're going to form a country. Well, that doesn't just happen overnight, y'all. What you need are baby steps, right? You need baby steps.
Baby steps? Baby steps. Baby steps. Baby steps. Baby steps. One little step at a time, and I can do anything.
Okay, y'all. So hopefully you finished watching all of the first part of the lesson. I know first and third period didn't quite get as far, so hopefully you saw the end part about the New England Confederation, which was largely a result of the Pequot Wars and problems with the French and Dutch, and is the first, as we said, baby steps towards a colonial unity being something besides individual colonies. Now we're going to come to probably the least known war in American history, but as far as percentages of dead Americans, percentage of the people who died, it is the deadliest. It is often called King Philip's War, although perhaps more correctly it should be called Metacom's War, because that was the name of the person who led it and organized it, his Native American name. Now, his father had given him the name of Philip, as in Philip of Macedon, and he had a brother by the name of Alexander, as in Alexander the Great, the son of Philip. So there was all that kind of thing, and he had taken this Christian name or whatever. But of course, he's going to renounce that and want his Indian name. So understand they're the same thing. It goes on just really for about a year and a half or so, if that. Now, what he had come to conclude with the death of his father, King Philip or Metacom had figured out the only way to finally defeat these whites, these English settlers, was to unite these tribes that had been fighting each other. Remember Pequot, Narragansett, the Wampanoags, and various other groups. They needed to unite each other. And so what Metacom does, or King Philip as the whites called him, and here's a bust of him that's out there, was he went around and very carefully, y'all, he visited Indian groups and he, quote, buried the hatchet. In other words, he made peace with these other Indian groups. Now, what he's going to do is he's going to set up a series of attacks. Now, for these attacks to work, and the word New England is partially covered there by the bust, I apologize for that. These attacks are going to be coordinated. So they all happen simultaneously, and the English aren't able to move people from place to place to fight against the various Indians. Make them happen simultaneously. Let's all work together. And it might very well have succeeded, except for something happening. A Indian who had been Christianized, maybe one of John Eliot's Indians from the Praying Villages, a man by the name of John Sussman, warned the colonists, hey, King Philip, I know you guys think he's cool with you guys. You think he likes you. He is planning a massive attack. Now, they didn't really want to believe it. Like, King Philip, Massasoit's son, he's a good guy. He wouldn't attack us. So they don't really want to believe it. But when Native Americans found out that this fellow Native American had betrayed him, what they do is they literally beat him to death one winter, in the winter before this happened. And when they beat him up, they take him and they punch a hole in the ice over the river or the lake, and they dump his body in there, and then they leave his hat. He had, like, you know, a European type hat, as some would do, right by it. So the idea is supposed to be that, oh, poor John Sussman, he was walking across the ice and he fell in and drowned. But when his body was taken out of the water and he was thawed out, it was clear that he was beaten black and blue and had been murdered by these Indians. And so what's going to happen is these Indians are going to be found, they're going to be arrested, and they're going to be hanged. And as a result, King Philip's plan to do this attack later, when they had carefully stored plentiful amounts of food and weapons and supplies to have this attack, he's going to have to launch the attack early. So he launches the attack early. He isn't quite ready, but he is able to do some real damage. Now, here is a painting from the time. As you can see, it's quite primitive in the way that it was drawn. But there you see Philip. Notice some interesting things here, y'all. He has a European rifle. He's got a couple powder horns here. Actually, another one up here. This dude is packed, right? You see like a shovel and stuff down here. There's another powder horn. Now, they attack throughout New England, and they wipe out, I mean, village after village, y'all, and absolutely show no mercy towards the English there. And they also get in some little individual bits of revenge. One story I remember is there was an Englishman, a guy who worked selling stuff in a little local store. And the Indians who were having a particularly hard time during this one time, they were starving almost. They come in and they're like, please, please, can we have some food? And he's like, what do you got? What do you offer? You got any furs? You got anything? And they're like, we don't have anything. Can you please feed us? And he's like, if you're so hungry, why don't you go eat some grass? And so they find this guy. And what they do, y'all, is they hold his mouth open and they stuff grass into him until literally he chokes to death on grass. Another thing that's kind of interesting is they do a lot of violence towards the animals. And this might seem really awful and cruel to us, but they really didn't like things like pigs, especially the damage and stuff pigs did to the environment, to their own fields and stuff. Pigs would dig through it. They would trample all over the Indians' fields and that kind of thing. They didn't like the damage that cows did. So they were particularly harsh when they found cows and those kind of things like that. There was also another guy that they didn't like, and they got a Bible and they tore the Bible into pieces. And I think if I remember right, they cut open his belly and they stuffed the Bible and its pages into his guts. So there was some pretty gross stuff that happens. Now, for a while, the colonists get their butts kicked. They are forced to retreat all the way back into Boston. That's what it says there. But then it comes to an end. Now, he doesn't get the bloody flux and dies. But what happens, y'all, is the colonists realize we got to change tactics. The way we had been fighting this, where we just basically stand there in groups and we all shoot from the open, has got to change. And they adopt what were called Indian tactics or hit and run tactics, where basically you go to the Indian villages, you burn the villages, you destroy their food crops, you take their women and children if necessary, and then you get the heck out of there before the Indians can retaliate. They learn those techniques. They learn techniques of hiding behind the woods and the trees when doing the shooting and not just making yourselves an easy target out there. Also, what they do too, y'all, is they begin to chip away at his Indian allies. They go after one Indian tribe, they defeat it, and basically say, look, you can help us against Philip or you can be wiped out. You help us, we'll save you. And so basically, one tribe after another, y'all, deserts the cause. And finally, it all comes down to it where King Philip and his family and a few followers are here in what is, well, was then Rhode Island as well, too, out in the Great Swamp. And there he is surrounded. And apparently, what ends up happening after being betrayed, he gets shot by a shotgun blast into the back. What they do then is awful, okay? But at least he seems to have been dead for it. What they do is what's called drawing and quartering. Now, what they do is they slice open your gut here and they pull out your intestines, sometimes even burning some of them. And then they quarter you, which means they cut off your arms and they cut off your legs. But with Philip, y'all, they went further. They put one of his arms like way up in the very, very tip of Massachusetts up here, and another one like down here, like one of his legs way up here and another leg down here. And then in Boston, y'all, they take his head, they put it on a pole, and it stays there for years, and they let all the animals and the insects just feed on the face until there's nothing but a skull. Now, they didn't do that just because they wanted to and were angry. They wanted to send a message to fellow Indians. Look what King Philip did. Look what we did to King Philip. Don't be like Philip, okay? And that was the message. So the war is going to end in a failure for the Indians, right? Like sadly, most of these things. As I said, he's beheaded, he's drawn, and he's quartered. They go even further. They take his son, they take his wife, and they sell them into slavery in the West Indies. And essentially, y'all, this is the last threat that Indians are going to pose in New England, okay? Now, a revolt with a little bit happier ending is going to be the Pueblo Revolt out in New Mexico. Now, this is different because it involves the Spanish. Now, this is considered a watershed event. Please add that word to your vocabulary. It's like a watershed. It's an illusion. Actually, that song is called Waterfall, but it's the closest thing I could find to that. Okay, so a watershed, y'all, is a turning point in history. Things just change, right? Things are never quite the same. And this is a watershed for the Spanish colonization in the Southwest. Now, it is specifically mentioned in the curriculum, like King Philip's War. You need, therefore, to know it. Okay, so the background info here. The Pueblo Indians, y'all remember this group of Indians that are jointly called Pueblos by the Spanish for the homes that they built, like Taos Pueblo down here. Remember this stuff from the beginning of the year. In modern day New Mexico, Arizona, and parts of Colorado. Now, Juan Añante, remember, had defeated a lot of the Pueblos. And remember Añante? He was the guy who ordered that 1 foot be cut off of each of the Ackermans who had fought against his forces. And remember the guy who attacked his statue a few years ago who cut off 1 foot. You can see that again. Let's give him his foot back and watch what happens here, y'all. There is his foot, and they actually cut it off the statue a protester did. I generally don't like violence towards statues, but you got to admire that one. Now, the Spanish even established a town. Notice it's the same year as Jamestown. It is Santa Fe, right? Our Holy Faith, Santa Fe as we call it. Now, the Spanish are very, very tough against the Pueblo Indians, but they are greatly, greatly outnumbered, right? Only 2,000 Spanish settlers versus 30,000 Pueblo Indians. So in 1680, just 4 years after King Philip's War, we're going to have this rebellion. Now, the Spanish priests, the Spanish government officials had been very, very suppressive of Native American religious practices. Anything they felt was against Christianity. They wanted a certain amount of assimilation that we'd already talked about. So Native Americans found their religion, their ways, their customs under attack. Also, the Spanish demanded tribute, that the Indians work for them. Wasn't quite encomienda anymore, but something similar. Hey, we need you to work for us. We need you to give us stuff, that kind of thing. So what happens is this man here, Pope, it's like Pope with an E on it, exclamation point E, he is going to organize a rebellion. And much like King Philip, he is going to plan for it to be simultaneous. Each Indian tribe that he talked into fighting got a little rope here with a knot in it. Each day they undid the knot, and the day they were out of knots, they attacked. Okay, so the attacks were simultaneous, and the Spanish, just like the Indians in King Philip's War, could not send troops backwards and forwards. And here you see the Spanish running away. This was a great victory for the Indians, one of the few. And so what makes this different, y'all, is the Spanish leave, and they're gone for almost 20 years. Between 1680 and 1696, the Spanish give up that territory. Indians rebuild their own kivas, their own religious centers. They tear down the churches. They begin to practice freely again. Ultimately, the Spanish come back, but they come back a little more humbled, y'all, a little bit less arrogant. So the significance here, y'all, it's one of the few that kind of worked. The Spanish do try to assimilate the natives religiously, but they do it a little bit more carefully. For one thing, they give them a lot more freedom. They also start allowing some Indian beliefs to be included into the Catholic ceremonies, showing some respect for Indian ways. And they're a little less brutal towards them. So if an Indian rebellion can be considered a success, y'all, this is about as close as any come, because it does drive them out for almost 20 years. The Spanish do return, but they return and they're more gently treating and that, okay? And that's, of course, the Spanish running away. So that pretty much concludes the Indian Wars thing there, y'all. Now we come to Bacon's Rebellion, y'all. And this is one of my very, very favorites because, well, Mr. D likes his bacon. But this is, of course, named after a man by the name of Bacon. Now, historians today, a lot of them like to call this America's first revolution. Notice it happens 101 years after we do start our revolution in 1775, right? So what happens to lead to this? Well, they're very unhappy. They're very discontent, and it's mainly single men. A lot of them were formerly indentured servants. They've done their 5, 6, 7 years. They're given land, if given land at all. And guess where the land is? Out in the middle of Indian country. So when they try to settle out there in the middle of Indian country, the Indians don't like it, and they attack them. So they ask their governor, Governor Barclay, to do something about it. Barclay, as you'll see, refuses to do anything because Governor Barclay didn't really care about these poor dudes way out there in the middle of nowhere, because he had a deal where he was already getting fur from the Indians and making money that way. So he doesn't want to mess up the people, his supplier, right, of all these furs. So he just let the Indians attack these guys. So these men, they don't have women. They don't have very good land. The land that they do have, they're in danger of being attacked. When they are attacked, their governor does nothing for them. So I'm going to show you briefly here, y'all, a Bacon's Rebellion, but it's a little bit different kind of Bacon Rebellion. This is from a TV show called Wife Swap, where for about a week or so, you would get a different wife to live with you and your children. And of course, your wife would then go live with the husband of the wife you're getting. So just watch what happens here. It'll come up here in just a sec. All right, so that's another type of Bacon's Rebellion. Another thing that they did to anger these men, y'all, was they took away their right to vote because they didn't have land. Initially, they could vote even without land. So Governor Barkley, as I said, that's how they pronounce it, would not retaliate against Indian attacks because he had his own deal going on. So this rich guy by the name of Nathaniel Bacon is going to lead a group of these discontented people in an attack. And it works for a while, y'all. They go after the Indians that attacked him. They then go after James. They burn it to the ground, and they chase Barkley away. Now, here's a picture of what Bacon looked like, okay? He was a wealthy guy leading these poor people. But then, y'all, what happens? Remember the bloody flux? Bacon gets it, and Bacon dies of the bloody flux. And without a leader, y'all, pretty soon this whole movement falls apart. And when it falls apart, Barkley returns. They bring in troops, and they're able to crush this rebellion. And then Barkley, y'all, he goes ballistic, man. He goes medieval on the people. He hangs more than 20 of the rebels. Even King Charles II says, man, you killed more people than I killed for killing my father, right? So we'll go ahead here, and I'll end with this song for you guys. I think the class is soon coming. Oh, let's see. I'm looking at my time here. Let's go ahead and see this little song here.
What is your emergency? I nailed my finger to a birdhouse accidentally. Do you have some bacon? Bacon, that's right. I have bacon left over from dinner last night. Rub some bacon on it. What? On your hand, just do it. Rub some bacon on it. That's all there is to it? What if I drop my phone? Rub some bacon on it. Or encounter my phone? Rub some bacon on it. I get mononucleosis. Rub some bacon on it. My nude pics get posted. Rub some bacon on it. Rub some bacon on it. Rub some bacon on it. Yeah. My home gets foreclosed. Rub some bacon on it. My cat explodes. Rub some bacon on it. I wake up in a trunk. Rub some bacon on it. My friend goes steampunk. Rub some bacon on it. I meet real pirates. Rub some bacon on it. There's an awkward silence. I say something unintentionally racist. Rub some bacon on it. I'm an adult with braces. Rub some bacon on it. I can't swim. Rub some bacon on it. I'm visited by Mr. Tim. Hey, boy. Rub some bacon on it. Rub some bacon on it. Rub some bacon on it. Yeah. What if I defeat the troll? I'm attacked by a narwhal. The apocalypse started. I think I might have sharded.
Hi there. If you're a human, you've probably got problems. Don't worry, just call the Bacon hotline. Tell the Bacon bot your problem, then follow his simple advice. It's that easy, and it's completely free. Dial 402-88-BACON. Oh, here's one right now.
Hey, Bacon Bot. Yes. Yeah, I keep having this horrible dream that the world runs out of bacon. Right.
So yes, what did that have to do with Bacon's Rebellion? Probably nothing. But you will not forget the leader of the rebellion now, will you? Bacon. And you won't forget that song. Trust me, you're going to be singing later. Rub some bacon on. You hadn't seen those guys in a while? Yeah. It's a little deep. So Bacon's rebellion is short-lived, right? But it scares the bejesus out of a lot of people. In fact, you could see lots of little bejesuses running around all over the place afterwards. And these problems are going to persist until the next century. First of all, it shows the really stark differences between this really handful of rich planters, right? That's what we called them. We called them the planters, the people that had multi-thousands of acres of land, and the poor farmers who were many. So you see that. It also shows some early colonial resistance to the British trying to control and do things for them.